All right, today we're going to tackle a really fascinating and honestly kind of mind-bending idea. It's called G0, and it's all about a perfectly stable form that has no center whatsoever.
I know. It sounds like a riddle, doesn't it? How can something be perfectly stable, totally viable, without having the core, a foundation holding it all together? Well, that's the exact puzzle we're going to piece together in this explainer.
Okay, so let's dive right in. Here's the official definition, but stick with me. Joe isn't stable because of its own internal strength. No, its stability comes from the fact that the environment around it is structurally broken in a very specific way. It's impossible for that environment to ever form a single, all-encompassing system. So its strength literally comes from the failure of everything else to get its act together. Bizarre, right? Let's build this whole idea from the ground up so it makes sense.
So before we can get to G0 itself, we've got to understand the unique world where it can even exist. And this world is built by a really specific process, this kind of never-ending spiral of questions.
All right, so the engine driving this whole thing is a pretty simple protocol. You've got 4 steps. You ask a question, you get a response, you analyze that result. But, and this is the absolute key, that analysis doesn't give you a final answer. Instead, it forces you to ask a new, deeper question based on what you just learned. So you can see it's not just a simple Q&A. It's basically a machine designed for perpetual, never-ending exploration.
And because every new question is deeper than the last one, the process can't just go in a circle. It's a spiral, right? It's always digging deeper, never coming back to the same spot. Now what's wild is that each individual step, each Q, R, H, is perfectly logical and coherent. But the system as a whole, it's constantly in motion, getting deeper, layering on more and more complexity. This whole process creates something the source material calls a spiraled site. And honestly, the best way to picture this is with an analogy. Imagine a library that's constantly, endlessly expanding. You're standing in one wing, and everything makes perfect sense, right? The books are organized, the layout is totally logical. But new wings are always being built, connected in weird ways, and because of that, it's structurally impossible to ever create a single, complete floor plan of the entire library. It's locally coherent, but globally, it's a beautiful, unmappable mess.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. After building up this incredibly complex space, the system does something that's almost inevitable. It starts to look at itself. It turns inward, becomes self-aware. And believe me, that is the start of a major crisis.
So at some point, the system spits out a statement that basically says, hey, wait a minute. If this piece of information I just found is a result of the way I'm searching, then I'm not just exploring this space, I'm creating it. It's this tiny spark of self-awareness. The system realizes its own rules, its own methods, are actively shaping the library. The explorer suddenly gets that it's also the architect.
And that right there is a huge shift in perspective. You can see it here. The system stops caring about the content. It's no longer asking, what is the answer to this question? Instead, it starts operating on its own structure. The question becomes, wait a second, how is my method of questioning changing the entire system? It's a total game changer.
This new self-reflection, well, it leads to a crisis that the source calls saturation. And you can see it in this chart. As the system tries to map itself, the complexity just explodes. The handled complexity stays kind of stable, but the unhandled residue, the paradoxes, the stuff that just doesn't fit, it grows and grows. And that required global logic, that single map of the whole library, it becomes completely structurally impossible to achieve. It's a dead end.
But here's what you've got to get. This isn't a failure. It's not a bug in the system. It's a fundamental feature. The system isn't breaking down. It's actually discovering a core truth about itself, that it is, by its very nature, unmappable. Those perfectly logical library wings, you just can't stitch them all together into one single unified blueprint. It can't be done.
So the system is completely stuck, right? It's in this infinite loop of self-reflection, trying to do the impossible. So how does it get out? Well, it doesn't solve the puzzle. It does something much smarter. It changes the rules of the game entirely. It triggers a necessary phase transition.
Okay, so when the system hits this absolute wall of saturation, this thing called a deactivation operator kicks in. And the best way to think about it is like a structural circuit breaker. You know when a circuit overloads? Click. It doesn't fix the overload. It just cuts the power. This operator doesn't solve the impossible puzzle of a global map. It just stops the system from even trying anymore. It just gracefully calls off the search.
And this is it's an incredibly elegant solution.
You see, the operator neutralizes that obsessive, global, self-reflecting loop. But, and this is so important, it preserves all the local coherence. Nothing is destroyed. All those library wings, they're still perfectly fine, totally viable. The underlying structure of the site is unchanged. The system just lets go of the impossible dream of having one big, total floor plan.
And now, finally, with that impossible global search turned off, with the system no longer obsessing about itself, the conditions are perfect. This is the moment when our mysterious form, G0, can finally emerge.
This is the real breakthrough right here. By deactivating that need for everything to fit into one single grand theory, the system creates these protected zones, little pockets of stability. And within these local patches, within each individual library wing, perfectly exact, stable forms can now exist. And they don't have to justify their existence to the entire system, they just have to work locally.
So let's decode what G0 actually is. This table breaks it down nicely. First, it's a fixed point, which is just a formal way of saying it's a stable, self-sustaining result. It just works. Second, it has a gradient, meaning it's not just a blob, it has a definite, exact structure. Third, and this is cool, it has minimal tension. It creates almost zero conflict with the wider system because it's not trying to be a global solution. And finally, the big one, it has no center. Its stability doesn't come from some central top-down principle. It's built from the local conditions up.
And that is our answer to the riddle from the beginning. G0 is the ultimate local solution. It's this exact, self-sustaining form that doesn't just survive without a global unified theory. It thrives precisely because that kind of theory is impossible. Its stability comes from the system finally accepting its own limitations. It's pretty profound.
Okay, so let's just do a quick run-through of the full sequence, the entire logical chain of events that gives birth to G0.
So, step 1. A spiral protocol creates this endlessly deep, unmappable site. Step 2. The system turns on itself, tries to make a total map. Step 3. That attempt fails, leading to structural saturation, a total dead end. Step 4. The circuit breaker flips, deactivating that impossible global search. And finally, step 5, in these new, calm, stable local spaces, the form G0 emerges. You can see it's a really solid step-by-step argument. A leads to B, leads to C, all the way to our solution.
And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. I mean, this whole model sounds super abstract, right? But think about it. Where else in our world do we see this? Where else do we rely on perfect local solutions precisely because some grand unifying theory of everything just fails? Maybe in science, in our communities, maybe even in our own lives. How often is real, lasting stability found not by chasing some impossible universal answer, but by building something that just plain works, right here, right now?